Gormaiget Loras and Curnakia, Gormaiget Eugenius and Churu Vain Shaw, lives in you, Comrade as a Harja, and Sasta on Brodel, Levain Shaw and you, Heinchfui, again, Ela Shamus Konya. Thanks, Eugene, for the invitation, Laura, for the introduction. I know I wasn't the first choice, Eugene, or the second. In fact, I know that I was the last choice of a rather desperate man, but nonetheless, I'm going to do my best today. If you're expecting a Marxist theoretician, you're going to be disappointed. My approach to most things is summed up by a quote I'm stealing off a good mate of mine, Cian McMahon. It's better to be roughly right than mostly wrong. And so I'm heading for the dizzy heights of being roughly right today. It's also, of course, the 12th of May, when we remember the sacrifice, but more so the legacy of James Connolly, our greatest thinker, who in turn referred to Marx as the greatest of modern thinkers and the first of the scientific socialists and the founder of the internationalism of the socialist movement. In a piece of classic understatement, Connolly also said in his piece, Ireland, Karl Marx and William Walker, that Marx, and I quote, knew a thing or two about socialism. It's also my dad's birthday today, 75, so unfortunately I won't be here for this evening's crack. I'm heading down to Westmeath, to the village of Fore, little village there, and I'll take my dad out to the local boozer, which is called the Seven Wonders of Fore. Usual fare, you know, kind of the tree that won't burn, the water that won't boil, the river that flows uphill, the usual shite, you know. And my dad was explaining to my youngest girl what the Seven Wonders of Fore was, you know, and he explained it to her, and my daughter says, Granda, is there an eighth wonder? And he said, yeah, it's a wonder anyone would fucking live here. But anyway, that's not fair. I actually like the village and it's a good boozer. The last 30 years, it's not an understatement to say that it's not been a favourable period for Marx, Marxism, or the left generally. We've seen, as you know, the emergence of a new phase of capitalist development, including a dominant role, of course, for finance capital, rollback of organised labour, deregulation, low taxes, massive and continuing privatisation. You know the list. And after the fall of the Soviet Union, we were warned, weren't we, about that being the end of history. But in warning about using quotes correctly, and today of all days we need to use our quotes correctly, Francis Fukuyama, or Fukuyama as I like to call him, he reminded us that we faced the prospect of centuries of boredom at the end of history. Well, the last 10 years have been anything but boring, and I think history's had its revenge. What we see, of course, emerging is full spectrum domination of free market theory. But it's not enough even to have a market economy. Now we apparently have to have a market society, the kind of society where we teach entrepreneurialism to 5-year-olds, and where universities no longer engage in critical debate or discourse, or even teach economics, but rather, as they do in Queen's, as an example, install derivative trading rooms in schools of management. We don't teach economics anymore, we just teach young kids how to manage the economy that exists, i.e. to be technically proficient managers of capitalism. It's a society in which for too many the impulse, if you like, to engage in political struggle is absent, because we're not just losing the political battle, we're losing another battle that's perhaps more important, that's the battle of ideas. Our inability to claim ownership of the material means of production is, of course, matched by our complete inability to own the intellectual means. The pace and depth of private ownership of the media and indeed the subservient nature that state media now plays to the market serves to kind of underscore the pole position of capitalist hegemony across the world. And increasingly, too many have bought into the logic of the market. The most pragmatic solution, we're constantly told, is to agree that there are no alternatives, and indeed to suggest otherwise is to be things that have been thrown at me in the last couple of years: utopian, uneconomic, impractical, or naive. And for those of us, and I'm sure there's many in the room, in whatever forum or indeed whatever party you belong to, those of us espousing the revolutionary ideas of our man Karl, and the ideas, of course, that those that followed him and built on this foundational work, it's been a challenging time to say the least. In the mainstream media, the role of our pundits, preachers and political leaders is to doom as impossible any radical or fundamental transformation of this system that he first analysed. And they've done their best, of course, to bury Marx and to bury his ideas. The problem's been compounded, of course, by the fact that even in the places where we would expect to be introduced to his ideas have been colonised by that same bourgeois free market thinking. The lesson for all of us is that capitalism has become so normal, it's become part of our common sense understanding of the world, and as such, there are no and there can be any alternatives. And this dictatorship of no alternatives has colonised the political and economic regime, of course. It's colonised academia, it's colonised our school curriculum. But perhaps what's most surprising and disappointing is the collusion of large parts of the left in this process. David Harvey says it well. After the Chilean coup, strong processes of neoliberalism have transformed the world, transformed us to the point that all of us are neoliberals, whether we like it or not. In the labour movement in particular, Marxism as a core concept is almost entirely absent. Capitalism and class simply do not feature, not in any real substantive way. How many of our members, how many of our officials, how much of our education is infused with the ideas of Karl Marx? It is most obvious to me in my experience and the people I work with in the slavish adherence of trade unions to the so-called skills agenda within trade union education, where we have individual approaches to personal development, improving our own economic opportunities that supersedes organising, collective bargaining, industrial action and the building of class power and class consciousness. Too much of our trade union education is infused with the language not of Karl Marx, but of lifelong learning, career pathing, personal fucking effectiveness. In too many places and too many of our progressive left spaces, we have, it seems to me, a whole generation of people who have come through with almost no familiarity, let alone training in Marxian political economy or indeed dialectics. And then, of course, into that kind of desert, the global financial crash of 2008 arrives, and those of us on the left, we stand back. Well, there you go, entirely predictable. Overproduction, underconsumption, speculation, crises, contradictions emerging. And in the mainstream even, it seemed for a while there was a genuine shock for those same pundits and preachers and political leaders, convinced as they are that this time they've ironed out capitalism's problems. In the Financial Times in 2009, famous headline, unthinkable a year before, the future of capitalism, they were asking. And they asked the question, the credit crunch has destroyed faith in free market ideology that's dominated Western economic thinking for a generation, but what can or should replace it? And it seemed for a while at least that elements of the bourgeoisie were kind of shitting themselves actually, and were scrambling around looking for answers. And as we know, sales of Das Kapital went through the roof in Germany and other places. The Communist Manifesto became popular again, Marx popular amid credit crunch. We even saw mainstream economists scrambling around for copies of Marx's writings, who they were being told had something to say about crises in capitalism. My favourite is Professor Brad DeLong, who describes himself as a free trade neoliberal, works in Berkeley, California, cites Adam Smith and Milton Friedman as his main influences. In 1991, DeLong wrote a couple of critical articles with Lawrence Summers, and they became the critical theoretical underpinnings, if you like, for the financial deregulation that took place when Lawrence Summers became Secretary of Treasury under Clinton. DeLong said, after the crash, Marx the economist, not Marx the revolutionary, obviously, he didn't go too far. Marx the economist was among the very first to recognise that the financial crises and depressions that afflict modern market economies were not a passing phase or something that could be easily cured, but rather a deep disability of the system, as we are being reminded again right now. For a time, a kind of pluralist politics, or pluralist economics, appeared in the scenes of the popular discourse. On late-night TV shows and late-night news shows, 2009, 2010, the odd Keynesian popped up, even a post-Keynesian. There was a few Marxists. I even remember a communist on Channel 4. I don't know how the fuck she got on there, but she managed to get on there anyway. Of course, that didn't last long. That debate was closed down very quickly. We kind of identified a few pantomime villains like Fred the Shred or Sean Gallagher. We identified them, we pilloried them, and we dressed them up as a few rotten apples that spoiled the otherwise spotless image of a dynamic and productive economic system, and went back to work. And what we've had since then, of course, over the last 10 years, is the reconstitution of class power, a dramatic shift to the right in most places, and kind of we've moved into a new normal of long-term secular stagnation, increasing authoritarianism, intolerance, mass surveillance, new Taylorist forms of work discipline, alongside, of course, the threat of automation and precariousness, and the prospect that in the very likely coming crisis in the next 4 to 5 years, we may well see the final assault on the remnants of that post-Second World War welfare compromise. But these changes, of course, aren't designed to reboot capitalism. They are the desperate response to a system that is in terminal decline. Capitalism really is in a parlous state. And unsurprisingly, in this context, try as the pundits might to bury him, Marx refuses to die, and is now more relevant than ever. And apparently everyone thinks so. Al Jazeera, 150 years of Das Kapital, how relevant is Marx? Even The Guardian, why the ideas of Karl Marx are more relevant than ever. The Spectator, Archbishop Rowan Williams, face it, Marx was partly right. That from a man that believes in invisible cloud people, but we'll leave that one. Two of my favourites actually, CNN, who was Karl Marx, trying to catch up, but my favourite is Fox News. Millennials agree with Marx more than the Bible, so things are indeed looking up. Of course, if you're going to understand and indeed apply the revolutionary ideas of Karl Marx, then the most important thing, Noel Martin reminded me of this today, is of course to read Marx. And I'm sure you'd agree that Marx is a great read. It is said that the beauty of reading Marx is the way his analysis of capitalism is like peeling back the layers of an onion to reveal the intimate workings of capital. Others have said, yes, reading Marx is indeed like peeling an onion, and that it can reduce you to tears. McQueen said in a really good article in 2005 called Reading the Unreadable that the more that people fear that Marx is impenetrable, the harder it will be to convince them to recover his relevance. So we need to stop saying that Marx is hard or that he's unreadable. And you can be guaranteed that the people that tell you that have never read Marx, and they don't want you to either. And neither is enough to read what others have written about Marx, as tempting and as useful as that is. Because the only way to challenge the accusation that Marx is unreadable is, of course, to read him. Capital in particular has been accused of, I love this quote, resisting mass readership. 800 pages in volume 1, 2,000 pages over the 3 volumes. And for those of you who complain, hopefully none of you do, but for those who do complain, think yourself lucky that the volumes that did get produced were only about 15% of what he had planned. He even warns us himself at the start of Capital, saying, the method of analysis which I have employed makes the reading of the first chapters rather arduous. My own first memories of Marx and reading Marx couldn't be more bourgeois as a student studying Gothic horror, and having the luck of a lefty teacher introducing Marx to us, but as a Gothic horror writer, sneaking it onto the curriculum in a very Catholic London school. And in the Gothic, of course, monsters are metaphors for unwelcome and uncontrollable change. And in Marx's writings, monsters, werewolves and vampires abound, because with Marx, we have for the first time a description of a new economic system, but a new economic system as Gothic horror. In his analysis of capitalism, he describes the emergence of the forces of production by a new bourgeoisie, like the summoning up of dark and powerful forces that are ultimately destructive, a Frankenstein's monster for the industrial age. In a passage from the chapter in Capital on the working day, Marx explains the vampiric nature of capitalism. Capital is dead labour, that vampire-like only lives by sucking living labour and lives the more labour it sucks. But it only slightly quenches the vampire thirst for the living blood of labour. And the parasitic nature of capitalism they outlines will feed and feed while there remains a single muscle, sinew or drop of blood to be exploited. Its Gothic influence extends even to the modern era in how we continue to describe this living, breathing, distortive system. 2 recent books, one by John Quiggin's, Zombie Economics, How Dead Eyes Still Walk Among Us, McNally's there, Monsters of the Market, Zombies, Vampires, the Global Capitalism. Of course, those metaphors and parables and narratives are important in describing capitalism as a dynamic and changing system, but ultimately as a monstrous one. And when you begin to see capitalism through that lens, through the lens that Marx gives us, you can't unsee it. And the way that Marx writes about it connects us to slavery, to colonial genocide, to the dark satanic mills of industrialization. And yes, of course, Marx's writings are full of literary devices and figures of speech and puns and paradoxes. He quotes Shakespeare and Goethe and Homer, a host of references to poets and dramatists I've never heard of. Marshall Berman reads the Communist Manifesto, he says, as a prose poem, and he called it the first great modernist work of art. But look, we'll stop there at that point, because there is a danger at this point of getting lost in kind of postmodern bollocksology, where we read Marx more for its aesthetic appeal than we do for its content. And it's the ideas that we're interested in. Above all, Marx wrote in a tradition of realism and never pursued style for style's sake. We'll quote Schopenhauer. The first rule, indeed, by itself, virtually a sufficient condition for good style, is to have something to say. And by fuck did Marx have something to say. Don't forget, as I did until I went and did a bit of reading, Marx was only 29 years old. Engels about 26 or 27 when they wrote the Communist Manifesto. 2 lads in their 20s. Let's remind ourselves of the beauty of that document. Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. All fixed, fast-frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudice and opinions are swept away. All new-formed ones are antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. all that is holy is profaned. Above all, Marx and indeed Engels' writing bring those ideas and analysis to life. They describe to us capitalism as a dynamic process, not as some sort of static abstraction. It is understood as a living, breathing system that we can understand because he provides us with a living, breathing theory. What we take from Marx is nothing less than a revolutionary framework for knowledge and the most rigorous, searching and comprehensive critique of capitalism that exists today. So these ideas then, what are they and what way are they applicable today? Does Marx indeed matter? And if anything, you could argue that the last 40 years has reconstituted the world of the 1860s that Marx knew so well. Crises, protectionism, war, monopoly. And I'm going to speak to a few of those ideas that are relevant to us in our work, as they should be to you in yours. I grew up in London, I don't know if you noticed, and every Saturday night we used to go to a local Irish club, Catholic club, called the Holy Rosary on Brixton High Road. It wasn't a hub of revolutionary activity, I can assure you. In fact, I thought Faith of Our Fathers was the Irish national anthem until I was about 13 years old. That kind of gives you the blue shirt nature of the place. The father from the Blue Shirt Midlands, mother from South Derry, kind of grew up with standard nationalist tropes. My knowledge of Irish history was kind of Celtic twilight, banshees, fairies and bastard redcoats, and it kind of stopped there. But on moving to and living in the 6 counties as a teenager, I was forced, of course, like many, to look beyond stories of the Great Liberator or the Two Tribes theory, and particularly when I got a job working in the anti-sectarian unit of Congress. I met a communist from the Shankill Road called Joe Law, who's some of you will have known Joe, of course. No longer with us, unfortunately. And he encouraged me to read Marx. Well, he said, "Read that, dickhead," was his exact phrase, I think. And he handed me a copy of Labour and Irish History and a volume of Marx's writings. And of course, reading Marx helped me to understand and metamorphosize, if you like, my understandings of, particularly the history of this place, the place of my children and my forebears. In understanding not that there was a kind of pike in the hayloft, but why it was there, why it was wielded, why plantations, why colonialism, why partition, why a carnival of reaction. And reading Marx inevitably takes you, as it took me, out of the comfortable ignorance of narrow nationalism, and you're forced to confront the theft, the violence and predation, yes, that lies at the birth of modern Irish history, but that too lies at the origins of something else, the origins of capitalism itself. And then to do this, Marx gives us a framework for analysis that he called primitive accumulation, that first and continuing process towards capital accumulation and the exploitation of wage labour. And if Marxism is anything, it's a theory of long-term historical change. Primitive accumulation explains how this new system emerges, how a new class of people gain the necessary assets and control to employ another class through wage labour, and as a new mode of production supersedes an earlier mode. As Marx says, freeing us from control over our own means of production. Our freedom, of course, is violent dispossession and wage slavery. So primitive accumulation is, yes, about the origins of wage labour, surplus value, how an urban working class is forged violently out of a dispossessed peasantry. He says, it is a notorious fact that conquest, enslavement, robbery, murder, in short, force plays the greatest part. Marx goes on to show in detail the harsh and cruel legislation enacted against those who had been expropriated or liberated from their previous ways of living, mutilating them for vagrancy, press ganging the unemployed and destitute into military service, extending the working day, limiting wages, outlawing strikes and workers' organisations and so on. I'll quote the man himself. Oops. If I go back one, there you go. Thus were the agricultural folk first forcibly expropriated from the soil, driven from their homes, turned into vagabonds and then whipped, branded and tortured by grotesquely terroristic laws into accepting the discipline necessary for the system of wage labour, after which, of course, this violence is replaced by the silent compulsion of economic relations. I mean, a stunning sentence. 200 years in one sentence, and then birth of a new mode of production. Marx shows us that the emergence of capitalism is anything but idyllic. It is written in the annals of mankind in letters of blood and fire. And of course, as primitive accumulation is well on its way to transforming Western Europe in the 17th century, the process of the coming together of the state, of banking and of credit and finance, of what Marx calls the bankocrats, the financiers, the renters, the bankers, the jobbers, allows the treasures captured outside of Europe by undisguised looting, enslavement and murder to flow back to the metropole and to be turned into capital. And he takes us then into the world of colonial plunder. The discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement and entombment in mines of the Aboriginal population, The beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins, signalled the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. And this process, of course, is celebrated by a vast Herod-like slaughter of the innocents. He gives short shrift to the histories we learn in school that equate the onset of capitalism with thrift or providence or the English spirit for trade or entrepreneurial genes. Primitive accumulation reads history differently, and so do we when we understand it. The agricultural revolution in England and the spinning jenny disguises the brutal theft of communal property. The Jacobite rebellion is underwritten by the savagery of the Highland clearances. The genocide of the Americas and African slavery are written as the wonders of the New World. The civilizing of Ireland is disguised from mass murder, dispossession, and the destruction of an ancient way of life. And we reread and we relearn history through Marx's analysis. My favourite is the retelling of the glorious revolution of 1688, very popular up north, and the much lauded Bill of Rights of 1689, about which Marx simply tells us brought into power, along with William of Orange, the landed and capitalist profit grubbers. With Marx, the capitalist mode of production transforms, yes, the mass of the population into wage labourers and their means of production into capital, and the colonial world into the commercial hunting of black skins, a system which comes into the world dripping from head to foot from every pore with blood and dirt. In our work, when you're trying to teach Marxian political economy, nearly always to people for the first time, primitive accumulation and that framework it provides us allows us, it becomes crucial actually, because it allows us to challenge and overturn the histories that reflect in their telling the idea that the ideas of the ruling class are the ruling ideas of the age. People think, because they are told by every institution in society, that capitalism's always been with us, that it's human nature, that it's natural, that it's the inevitable result of a Darwinian struggle, and so there's no point fighting it. Primitive accumulation allows us to show that it's not normal, it's not natural, it's coercive, and it's violent. And in allowing us to understand even the simple idea that capitalism didn't always exist on the planet, and show people that there was a pre-capitalist world with a different mode of production, well, perhaps then they can begin to envisage a post-capitalist world. And to combat that embedded thought that everyone seems to carry now, that it is easier to imagine the end of life on Earth than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And why is this relevant? It's relevant because the ideas of the ruling class are still the ruling ideas of the age. It's funny that when we talk of Marxian political economy, because Marx, of course, called what he gave us a critique of political economy. Of course, what he meant was classical political economy, particularly in which the stories of the birth of capitalism play in classical political economy the same role that original sin does in theology. So the origin of capitalism is told with the same kinds of myths, and Marx beautifully mocks that mythology. He says, long, long ago there were two sorts of people. One, the diligent, intelligent, and above all frugal elite. The other, lazy rascals, spending their substance and more in riotous living. The former sort accumulated wealth, and the other latter sort finally had nothing to sell except their own skins. And from that original sin dates the poverty of the great majority. He says about that mythology, such insipid childishness is every day preached to us in defence of property. And yet that idea of the dazzling entrepreneur bestriding the globe and the rest of us, the undeserving, indolent scum, muppets and chavs of the world, is still the dominant ruling idea of the age. And why is it? Because almost immediately at the birth of capitalism, in that period of primitive accumulation, Marx shows us that that insipid childishness of that view of the world becomes the ideological support for the system and becomes deeply embedded in our culture and our language and our way of thinking. The common people must, of course, be put to work, is the idea, but alongside coercion, they must be made to believe that work is a virtue and not working a vice. And so the war on sloth, on idleness, on laziness, on unemployment begins, and central to that, of course, is the immediate eradication of leisure time and holidays. Marx makes it known to us early on in Capital that in order to restore a social world and to retain the commons, the working class has to rebuild a shared culture of something we like to call leisure. The saving of labour time is equal to an increase of free time, i.e., he says, time for the full development of the individual. And so in early capitalist development, and indeed ever since, the class struggle becomes a struggle too over time itself. And of course there is an immediate drive by the capitalist class to extend the working day, to which Marx says, and there, he says, arises the voice of the worker to say no. We see in the Chartist movement in the mid-19th century, in the fight for the 10-hour day, in the fight against child labour, and of course in the early trade union campaigns for 8 hours work, 8 hours rest, 8 hours for what we will. And without lionising pre-capitalist societies, it is fascinating to note that peasants enjoyed, even though they lost maybe 50% of their produce through expropriations to the feudal lords, they enjoyed about 50% of their time free. That time being spent in leisure, holidays, festivals, or just dossing about. As late as the 1830s, the Anglo-Irish bourgeoisie were complaining to London that the Irish working year contained only 200 days' work, and that the bastard paddies had 165 days off every year. And it runs as a theme and practice in capitalism, the disciplining and control of the worker, not just in work, but in life itself. John Locke, the father of liberalism, wondered whether the commencement of work shouldn't begin at 3 years old. Daniel Defoe of Robinson Crusoe fame said 3 years is way too young, 4 years old is fine. Jeremy Bentham suggested a privately owned joint stock company subsidised by the government to house and put to work what he called the criminally poor and destitute, to create, as he said, quote, so many crucibles in which dross of this land can be converted into sterling. His idea was rejected 200 years ago, but 200 years later it's found its apogee in mass incarceration and the prison industrial complex in America. On the one hand, the suppression of free time, and on the other hand, the celebration of work, work as virtue, which of course becomes part of our history, understandably. Even as you go and visit an old relation and they sit dying of asbestosis with crippled fingers, people will say, I bet he misses his work, does he? Does he miss the work? And when we put him in his grave and we stand over the casket at a wake, people say, I've never seen a man like him for the work. Jesus, he loved the work, didn't he? And we collaborate in that idea. Now, we do it, of course, because we have no alternative resources. We surrender to what Marx calls the silent compulsion of market forces, because we have no choice. But worse, it becomes our common sense. And we defend it, and we begin to take pride in our own wage slavery, because we forget to look beyond it towards real freedom. Marx says, we find on the market then a set of buyers, possessed of land, machinery, raw materials, and the means of subsistence, all of them, save the land, the products of labour. And on the other hand, a set of sellers who have nothing to sell except their labouring power, their working arms and brains. And it's this so-called equality in the marketplace, and it deludes the mass of the population, even today, into believing the doctrines of liberty endowed in the notion of private property. And it deludes them to believe the cruel illusion of freedom in a market which coerces by compulsion workers to sell themselves. Marx pulls the illusion asunder in a few words. There is nothing more unequal than the equal treatment of unequals. We should never underestimate the significance of this analysis, because the entire process that we've outlined briefly today is invisible to the modern economist, who, couched in the rhetoric of liberty and freedom, refuses to see the state, law and authority exist simply to extract surplus labour and profit from surplus value and profit from our labour. But with Marx, we have a detailed exposition of the dispossession of the rural population, the destruction of pre-capitalist societies ongoing, the enclosure of the commons, the privatisation of state lands, the international system of banking and finance, and of course slavery, colonialism, and all that gives us an understanding of primitive accumulation. A view of the world, as I said, that once seen, once understood, cannot be unseen. From introducing us to the birth of capitalism, to its early steps, Marx takes us into its expansion, its stagnation, its decline, and inevitably its death. Back in the 1850s, Marx, as you know, was a business and financial correspondent for the New York Tribune, largest paper on the planet at the time. And in discussing the first real great recession of capitalism, the 1857 recession, he concentrated his analysis on the policies of Credit Mobilier, the world's first real investment bank. And he noted that the bank's statutes allowed it to borrow up to 10 times its capital. It used those funds then to purchase shares in French railroad companies, industrial corporations, increasing output, but then no one could be fined. There's no purchasers for the output, so then the shares drop and they can't pay their loans and the bank collapses. Replace Credit Mobilier with Lehman Brothers, or the Anglo-Irish Bank and French railroad firms with Irish real estate or mortgage-backed securities, and you're in 2008. And the stupid ask us whether Marx is still relevant. In typical fashion, of course, ever since 1857 and up to including 2008, politicians, economists and commentators pin the blame for these major crises on inadequate gold supply, the Crimean War, credit supply, or some permutation of other factors. And apologists for capitalism are forever falling over themselves to provide kind of particularistic explanations of the crash. And of course, any boom that follows, they claim that whatever caused that last crisis won't happen again. The problems have been finally solved. And we saw it immediately before the last crash in 2008. The word bubble drives me nuts, Nobel Prize winner Eugene Farmer. The central problem of depression prevention has been solved. That's handy. Nobel Prize winner Robert Lucas. Are you missing the real estate boom? The boom will not bust. On our own version of that intellectual giant of ours, the boom is only getting fucking boomier. Our contribution to the world political economy. And of course they deny that these crises are inherent in capitalism, because the whole of their economic theory, such as it is built on the idea that capitalism is self-regulating and if left alone will continue to grow unimpeded. And so any breakdown in that system has to be identified as an exceptional deviation from the norm, an exogenous shock, I think is the language they use. So we have emerging the modern economist, looking in the wrong direction and asking the wrong questions. And these people, of course, dominate not just the media, not just our academia, not just the political class, even the labour movement. Marx, of course, located the root cause of crises in capitalism's cyclical character, and the distinctive feature of Marx's series of crises, of course there are more than one, is their emphasis on the necessity of crisis as an essential and ineradicable feature of the capitalist mode of production. The problem is, I suppose, for us, is that nowhere does Marx present a kind of systematic and thoroughly worked out exposition of his theory. That's not to say it doesn't exist, it just exists in various parts of his writings. Most importantly, perhaps what comes down to us is that idea of the inherent tendency to crisis that underlies our increasingly permanent instability of social existence under capitalism. And yes, of course, at various times Marx associates it with the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, the iron law, tendencies to overproduction, underconsumption, overaccumulation. In Volume 1 he says, the life of modern industry becomes a series of periods of moderate activity, prosperity, overproduction, crisis and stagnation. And of course, since the onset of this great recession in 2008, the debate has been whether it was caused by a crisis in the capitalist process of production, i.e. falling profitability, that eventually triggered a banking and financial collapse, or whether it was financialization and finance capital that provoked the collapse. Marx, of course, never used that term, finance capital. That came later, but he does describe in detail the centrality of the circulation of capitalism, of capital based on credit and debt and loans, and how the centralization of that system gives to this class of parasites the fabulous power not only to periodically despoil industrial capitalists, but also to interfere in actual production in a most dangerous manner. Marx reveals to us the contradictions of the credit system, a device for overcoming barriers to production that allows accumulation and expansion, which in turn becomes a lever for overproduction and speculation, what Marx calls insane forms of fictitious capital. And as speculative insanity goes, 2008 gives us a study in extremis of what Marx's analysis predicts. My favourite is the study, and I'm still at it, the derivatives market. In 2007, before the crash, the trade in derivatives, futures markets, debt markets, credit markets was $1 quadrillion US. That's about 15 zeros. How many apples can you buy with $1 quadrillion? What does that get you down a shop? Someone tried to work it out to find out the GDP of this one market in capitalism. And they worked out that it was equivalent to 10 times the value of the total production of goods on the planet over its entire history. 10 times the total value of every flint knife and axe that we napped since we wandered out of Africa 170,000 years ago. Insanity is an appropriate term. The insanity, of course, is produced by what Marx called the rise of a new financial aristocracy, which accelerates crisis formation and, quote, brings elements of disintegration to the fore, creating a self-dissolving contradiction, and therefore reinforcing that inherent and inescapable crisis of capitalism, which unfortunately hasn't gone away. This financial aristocracy is central, of course, to capitalism's expansion. It takes us beyond the processes of primitive accumulation, and even beyond the rather detailed study, sometimes people would accuse Marx of a rather closed study of capitalism in Capital. And it takes us into a more violent, aggressive and expansionist system that Marx hinted at, though never fully developed. But through the work of Hilferding, if you haven't read it, on finance capital, and of course the work of Luxemburg and Lenin, we recognise the emergence of what Luxemburg simply calls the violence of imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism and that underlying drive and quest for markets and resources all over the world. As Lenin said, it is beyond doubt, therefore, that capitalism's transition to the stage of monopoly capitalism to finance capital is connected with the intensification of the struggle for the partitioning of the world. as we're seeing again right now. So from Marx through to Lenin, primitive accumulation, inherent crises, finance, capital, imperialism, these are the ideas that define our analysis and our ability to understand our world, and that keep us engaged, of course, in the struggle to change it. So is Marx still relevant? Before Marxism is anything, as Laura said in her introduction, it is a critique of capitalism. And as long as capitalism exists, so will Marx and his revolutionary ideas. And of course, it's ours. There's no Marx for the ownership class, unless you include the lunatic ramblings of Ayn Rand. As a materialist, Marx too had no time for those who approached his writings as sacred text or dogma, but rather as a revolutionary framework to build and share knowledge and analysis and direct us towards political action. And as a revolutionary, he would judge the success of his writing and his ideas by our ability to use them to overthrow the capitalist system. And back to my first point, he would have wanted us to read what he wrote. And as a revolutionary, he would have thought, I'm thinking, that if you find reading about capitalism a bit challenging, well, you're not going to be much fucking use in trying to overthrow it. There is no doubt that since 2008, that the neoliberal orthodoxy has been damaged. The high priests of the free markets and deregulation that couldn't predict the crash have no remedy other than more of the same. And it seems to me and to many of us I know that we're living through a very real structural crisis of capitalism. The rates of growth that experienced after the Second World War are gone and will not be recovered. All the more reason for socialists, leftists and communists to engage in that battle of ideas and to reintroduce, where you can, Marx into the spaces from which he's been banished. I'll leave the last words to our man Lenin. The genius of Marx lies in his having been the first to deduce from the lesson world history teaches and to apply that lesson consistently. The deduction he made is the doctrine of the class struggle. Thank you, comrades. Gormagi.